And I think that all the people who are going to put money in, say the new money, is going to demand that the old money be wiped out. And I think that it happened in Greece. This is much worse than Greece. They didn't happen enough, I agree. But because in part, a lot of that debt was also internal in Greece, and you would have wiped out the Greek banks or the European banks. So in this case, there's no domestic debt because inflation has wiped it out. Hyperinflation has wiped it out, so at least we have that. We don't have a domestic financial system that can go broke because we don't have a domestic financial system. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Sid Redner. I'm a resident faculty member. I want to ask a very different kind of question. Is that Venezuela is horrible. It's a horrible collapse, but there's also other ones in Latin America which are very prominent. Is there some cultural aspect to this that plays a role? And I'm sort of very much influenced by John Crow's book, The Epic of Latin America.
I don't think so. I mean, I think that you haven't seen very many of these things. The recessions I showed to you in Chile and Argentina. We understand sort of like the macroeconomics of them, and we understand what makes emerging markets relatively more fragile. In the 90s, I developed this theory that I call the original sin, which is the fact that they borrow abroad in foreign currency, and that when they get into trouble, the currency weakens, so the debt becomes more expensive, so it becomes harder to pay, so the currency weakens, so the debt becomes more expensive, and that's why they end up in these bad equilibria, and that part of it is sort of like an inadequate integration to global financial markets. But I wouldn't say culturally, the U.S. is soon going to pass a debt to GDP ratio of 100%. We in Latin America are profligate at, I think the profligate countries get at 60%. The debt is much more expensive, so it's hard to get more. But it's not. I wouldn't say that running the kind of fiscal deficits that the U.S. is running right now, in the middle of a boom, that would count in Latin America as super hyper irresponsible. Maybe because the U.S. has access to funding at a different rate and so on. But your current fiscal stance would be way more irresponsible than the standard Latin American policy. Yeah.
Sorry, because I am from South America and I lived through some of the hyperinflation, so I was very interested by this picture. Perhaps it's simplistic, but I was thinking that what characterizes this as so unique is that perhaps it's similar to what happened in many places in South America, or has happened, but never before in a place with so much oil, so much richness, so much flexibility. I wonder whether this big collapse couldn't happen like this in other countries, because what this amount of oil allowed politically, you haven't talked very much about the
politics.
No, about the poverty, about the inequality, etc. And some of all of that relates ultimately to manipulation, to corruption, to the way these kinds of governments can use badly all these resources. So I think there has been no country in all this, even the one in Chile. You can think of civil war, you can think of political issues. Ultimately, I think what is very unique here is the resources that this government had when this collapse was initiated.
I mean, what happened to the oil sector is maybe a metaphor for the whole country. So you're sitting on huge potential, right? The largest oil reserves in the world, supposedly. So you're sitting on huge potential, and it requires some effort to get it out. You may not know how to do it. The world is full of people who know how to do it. So you just have to strike a deal. And we had a nationalized oil company. We nationalized it in the 70s. It was a fairly well-run oil company. It was meritocratic. The government didn't like this meritocracy. It thought that it had no respect for expertise. You've seen that in other places, of no respect for expertise. So, and so they thought that all of these restrictions on getting hired, on being promoted, and so on, were just a ruse of those in power to control. So they ended up challenging them. They went on strike, and they fired 20,000 workers out of 35,000 workers, starting from the top. So they destroyed the whole human capital of the industry. And that, I think, started the process of collapsing that oil company. Because to produce oil, you need to have oil reserves. You also need some know-how and some collective know-how that you're able to put together. But if this attack on the invisible hand also attacks those teams, you just cannot implement the needed technology to realize those gains. So yes, I think it was politics, if you want, that destroyed even the capacity to get the oil out. And that's why oil collapsed.
So I'm sorry, we have to move on. I'm sorry, we're at the end of time. But I do, Ricardo, you're remarkably restrained in your comments about Maduro and Chavez. And just for 30 seconds, could you give us a sense of the scale of corruption in the current Maduro? Just give us a couple of anecdotes, because I think people may not appreciate just how heinous this particular government is.
Well, what do we know for a fact? We know for a fact that Chavez's bodyguard became the national treasurer. He eventually left to the U.S., was indicted on corruption, plea bargained, and declared having received $1.5 billion in bribes, which are now, most of those assets have been seized by the U.S. government. The vice president at the time was named as a drug kingpin, and his assets were seized. The government doesn't know what the assets are until they're sanctioned, and then the financial system tells the U.S. government what they found in. So they found $900 million in assets in the U.S. I presume that he didn't put all of his eggs in this basket. We have found some $4 billion in the private bank of Andorra. We found $1.5 billion in a bank in Bulgaria that we've seized. So these are just, We invested, more serious, we invested $50 billion in the electrical grid and didn't increase electricity capacity by 1 kilowatt. So I cannot tell you what happened to the money. I can tell you what happened to the electricity. So I presume that this has been, corruption at gigantic scale.
Okay, join me in thanking Ricardo.
Thanks so much for inviting me and letting me share some words with you and some ideas. So unlike the last two talks, I'm not going to tell you about the collapse of any specific system. I'm going to do what Jeffrey's more interested in and tell you some toy models that give us some underlying mechanisms and insights into how things can fail. So I do study networks, and part of why I study networks is because I know that complex interdependent networks are the core of modern society: social networks, biological networks, technological networks. And these networks are increasingly interacting with each other. They're increasingly cyber-physical. They're increasingly socio-economic. We can think, for instance, about, say, like a virus that's mutating on a biological gene regulatory network. That virus spreads over human contact networks. Those human contact networks have long-distance links enabled by critical infrastructure like airline networks. Those airline
wealthier every decade of the Roman Empire down until the outbreak of this first plague. So that's one, I think, problem for the endogenous model, for the Malthusians. The other is that there's really no relationship mechanistically between running out of energy and the outbreaks of these diseases. And so take the example of bubonic plague, which is a disease that we understand relatively well in its mechanics. It's actually a rodent disease that has enzootic reservoirs, for instance, in Central Asia, that spills out, is capable of infecting commensal species, principally the black rat, and then hopping. It's a vector-borne disease transmitted largely by flea bite from the black rat's fleas to us. And there's really not a good story to be told that this plague happens in the 6th century because the society has outrun its energy supply. So there's no mechanistic story in which these biological shocks are easily endogenous to the energy system. So I have a hard time believing that these mortality shocks are exogenous, or anything but exogenous, in terms of a strict Malthusian model. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're exogenous or completely random. And I think Malthus is just a sort of ecologist who gets halfway there. He's just looking at one side of the relationship of a species and its population numbers, which is how does it acquire food. So as this chimpanzee is telling you, all of nature, you just have to acquire energy and avoid becoming energy for something else, whether that's predators or your parasites. So I don't think that this link does a very good job of telling us why the Romans experienced these huge biological shocks. I actually think these links probably do a better job of telling us. So I think the best Malthusian theory on offer is Peter Turchin's. You may know this book. If you don't, I highly recommend it. He is arguing for an essentially traditional endogenous Malthusian model, but he does it in a way that's fairly sophisticated by arguing that when a society starts to run out of energy, it sort of works its way through the social superstructure. The aristocracy has more trouble extracting wealth, and then they start fighting amongst each other. And so you see these secular cycles of rise and fall, of efflorescence and crisis, with time lags to the Malthusian system, but that are ultimately really about the Romans running out of energy. And he even wants the Roman case to be a Malthusian secular cycle. So we have models of sort of the historical period of human history in which these long cycles of growth and collapse are driven by energy. What we don't have, and what fascinates me as a historian, is very many historians who are thinking really hard in the long term about the biology of the infectious diseases of human beings, human parasites. And parasites do regulate animal populations in density-dependent mechanisms. We know that infectious disease is highly density-dependent. And think about Rome. It's a city of 1 million people. We know that Rome itself was a demographic sink. It was extremely unhealthy. Here I show you a Roman mega-toilet where 50 people could sit together at the same time and stare at one another. But this is just a symbol of the fact that many of the most important infectious diseases of humans, like bacillary dysentery or typhoid, are diseases of waste and are far exacerbated by density. Another important fact is that human numbers are necessary to sustain certain virulent pathogens. So the measles virus is a classic example. It's disease, respiratory disease spread directly between humans that can't avoid extinction in small populations. So measles is a real freak of nature. Monkeys don't have measles. They can't. If they go extinct in a day, they probably do get diseases that are biologically as virulent. They just probably go extinct all the time. What's weird about humans is we have so many of these diseases that shouldn't exist and couldn't exist if we didn't have large and extremely dense populations. Moreover, I think we can say that the fact that human numbers have grown so much over human history makes us good sources of energy. It increases the populations of our parasites, which means that they're evolving more. And so our evolution, our success as a species has also been a huge success, boon for our parasites who are, of course, always mutating and trying new things. So one of the things I'm trying to think about is how weird the human germ pool is. Here's a little outdated. This is Charles Nunn's data from 2003. Here are the number of parasites, and here number of parasites, and then this is the frequency, number of primate species. So you can see most primate species have a handful of known parasites. The most known parasites of any other primate is chimpanzees. The number is a little bit higher than this, 70, 80 parasites that infect chimpanzees. Humans have thousands of pathogens that can infect us. Of course, there's a huge sampling problem. We know a lot about our own biology and the things that threaten us, but I think anyone who's looked at this closely would affirm that humans have a really, really weird disease pool. We have a lot of diseases. We have a lot of viruses and bacteria, which honestly most other primates have nothing like the viral and bacterial load that a human society has, and we have particularly virulent pathogens. So this is the human germ pool is itself a product of our demographic success. So maybe we should see the emergence of these new diseases like smallpox as part of the larger story of human population growth and its influence on our infectious disease environments. Smallpox, we think, probably emerges from a rodent virus that at some point in history, not long ago, probably on the order of around 2,000 years ago, adapts to humans and spreads. If it had adapted to humans 5,000 years before, it would have gone quickly extinct. But because it adapts to humans about 2,000 years ago, it enters into the trade networks of the Roman Empire. The Romans are trading with Africa. They're trading across the Indian Ocean. This is probably a disease that comes into the Roman Empire from Central Africa, up the Red Sea, to the extent we can sort of chart it coming into the Roman Empire from the outside, and then once it reaches the Roman Empire, it kills millions of people. The bubonic plague, as mentioned, this is a germ where we're starting to get a really interesting evolutionary history. It didn't just emerge in the Roman Empire. It now looks like bubonic plague has been a part of human societies for several thousand years before the Roman Empire. It's a very interesting and unresolved question right now. Why do you suddenly get a pandemic? There's no evidence for bubonic plague pandemics that are intercontinental before the 6th century. So whether there's some molecular evolution or some ecological change that human societies create that lets this disease have the mortality of impact that it does in the 6th century, a little bit of an open question. It probably has to do with, at least to some extent, with human ecological transformation. We create cities, we store grain. The fact that black rats live commensally with us exposes us to the pandemic potential of this disease. So zooming out from Roman history, I actually think this is what the Romans experience is sort of the common pattern of human history, really from the Pleistocene down until the modern period. Historical demographers lie to you all the time and tell you that human societies grow at 0 or 0.1% over long periods. In fact, human societies usually grow at 1 or 2%. This is true of hunter-gatherers. It's called the forager paradox. It's a big problem that observers of hunter-gatherer societies don't really understand. Where do they go? The answer is they're probably killed by epidemics. This is certainly the pattern in Neolithic Europe, a pattern of boom and bust, whether it's Malthusian or sort of ecological and parasites, open question. And this, of course, continues into the Bronze and Iron Age. So I would say that the Roman pattern is representative of a broader pattern of volatility in human social development, where you have sort of centennial scale dynamics that are driven partly by Malthusian cycles. I have no doubt that if a society continued to grow, its population continued to grow, that it would, in the pre-modern period, experience food shortages. So I don't think this is exclusive from a pretty traditional Malthusian. I just think that an exclusively Malthusian energy-based explanation has a lot of trouble while all of a sudden you get these large shocks in human population history. So here's what human historical demographers often tell you. This is a much used environmental database, High 3.1, that shows human population growth throughout the Holocene. And here you see how smooth it is. But even they can't quite smooth out the Roman pandemics and the Black Death and discovery of the New World. But if we zoom in even a little bit, here's, I think, one of the best multi-millennial population records we have. It's from Italy. There is a lot of guessing in this. I know the evidence that this is based on very well. I don't agree with everything about this reconstruction that Paolo Malanima and Elio Locascio did, but it's a very good one. And the black line is what really happened to the Italian population over 2,000 years. And this is the Antonine Plague. This is the Plague of Justinian. I actually think this should be more like this, but nonetheless, these are driven by these two major events, and then the Black Death. But if you just look at long-run human population history and smooth it out into a growth rate over these really long periods of time, you're missing something really fundamental about the dynamics of human society that's driven, I think, by our relationship with our pathogens. So last slide. I observe in human history that large-scale pandemics are really important shocks. These reverberate social systems, and ultimately they put pressure on states and societies in ways that cause large-scale collapse. I think that's the story of what happened to an empire. Pandemics have biological causes, so I think we have to take biological mechanisms very seriously as historians. And ultimately, if we're looking for what describes the patterns or even laws that underlie these, we're talking about patterns in human population history, the ecology of human societies, and the way that facilitates and interfaces with the evolution of our parasites, and then how that would challenge us to think about the modern world, where we gain the upper hand in many ways, at least partly over our most important parasites, how that plays a role in runaway population growth in the last few hundred years, how stable that is, since pathogens, of course, continue to evolve and to adapt to the world that we've created, are very much open questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. In some ways, it's perfect ending for the morning. I suspect there are a lot of questions. I want to ask a first one, though, very quickly. We'll get to Derek in a sec. So when I was first here on sabbatical in 2002, John Paget was here writing about Florence and the remarkable recovery after the Black Death in Florence. Florence lost, I forget what it was, half the population or something, and it was remarkable how resilient that system was. So can you just say another word or two about why these shocks actually led to the collapse of the Roman Empire? Because you also talk about them as partly stabilizing influences as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The certainly the way we judge the effect of these biological shocks isn't an aesthetic judgment, as the Italians have a Renaissance. Right in the middle of the...
They seem to do just fine.
Like that. They do just fine in certain ways, unless you're one that loses half the people around you. So there's a really complex relationship between sort of cultural dynamics and biological ones that I think we don't have to assume that every time there's a biological shock that society enters some sort of terminal decline or certainly sort of cultural stagnation. But the more important thing that you're getting at is, Italy, Italian city-states prove fairly resilient, and the Roman Empire in the 6th century, I think, doesn't. I think that's a really hard question. The Italian city-states of the 14th century are much smaller. In fact, I think one of the main differences of all of Europe in the 14th century and the Roman period is that you have much smaller states. And in that sense, the Roman Empire is really weird. It's this huge formation that's in many ways just this 10,000 kilometer frontier that it has to defend with an army. And so when you have a biological shock and you lose half the population. We know that in the 6th century, the Roman state is struggling to collect taxes. We can watch it raise tax rates. We can watch it struggle to pay its army. Then we watch it struggle to recruit an army. And you start to see holes poked in the frontier, and it can close one at a time, but then another one opens, and ultimately it's unable to defend that sort of frontier shield on that scale. So I think that's a really different configuration. And then maybe my friend Walter Scheidel is about to come out with a book called Escape from Rome that I think is very powerful and argues that the Roman Empire is really weird, and that only once in Western Eurasia did you even get a state with the geographical kind of dynamics and size and shape of the Roman Empire, and it was anomalous. There never could or should be a unified empire across all of Europe, maybe unlike parts of Central Asia or East Asia geographically. And so maybe the Roman Empire was a one-off that was bound to fall apart in some way, but I would still argue that even if it's geographically anomalous, that you need to explain what the actual proximate mechanisms of its collapse are.
I wish certain fascist rulers in the 20th century had fought. I read that book, yeah. It makes me think of cascading failures and various things. But Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, great. And a very similar question, so just talking about it a little more. If we think in an evolutionary sense, after you reach a certain level of fitness, you don't have to be sort of fit on some absolute level to survive. You just have to be fitter than your neighbors and the people that you're competing against for resources. And presumably the people who are stressing the Roman Empire, they're getting them. They're getting smallpox as well, if it was smallpox. And so, but I heard you, I think, mostly answer what I was thinking about when you say, if it's having difficulty maintaining and recruiting an army. Was the Roman Empire sort of under stress in many places and had to have this strength and had to have more strength than its neighbors? So when its neighbors and itself were weakened, they sort of came down to a more equal level, and then it was more vulnerable?
Yeah, those are hard questions. I'd say a couple things that I think we could argue or hypothesize at least. That one thing that certainly happens is technology convergence. So in the year 1, in the Augustan period, Rome has fairly significant technological advantage over particularly its northern neighbors. To less extent, the Parthians and then the Persians, who are more kind of equal in terms of their technology and social complexity. But the Germanic peoples are fairly simple in their social organization, fairly primitive in their technical development, and that changes. And so part of the historical dynamic is simply you have a convergence between the Romans and the peoples across their northern frontier. I do think that the Romans had trouble in maintaining legitimacy. They have to permanently maintain a very large and complex frontier network, whereas if you think about what are the incentives for the agents beyond the frontier, all they need to do is raid. And in some sense, raiding is probably easier than defending. And then thirdly, it's a really hard question about whether or not some of these diseases affect the enemies or neighbors of Rome as much as they do the Romans themselves. I don't think it's necessarily the case, because the Roman society is more urbanized, more interconnected. There's more trade. That doesn't mean that there's not towns and there's not trade beyond the Roman frontiers, but the Roman society its ecology is more vulnerable to large-scale pandemics than its neighbors probably. So the problem is we don't have as much evidence for the kind of barbarians or people beyond Rome's frontiers as we do for the Romans themselves. So maybe we'll start to get at that through bioarchaeology, but it's still really hard to say to what extent some of these pandemics go beyond Rome.
And the ancient DNA stuff that's happening now is going to be great for what you're doing. I mean, RNA, it's a DNA virus. Sorry, smallpox is a DNA virus.
Yeah.
If people died of smallpox then, in a year or two, people are going to find that.
I think so. People are trying. This is where the plague is sort of ahead of everything else right now. And so we actually have an amazing picture of the Justinianic plague and the subsequent outbreaks from, first there was 1, then there was 2. There's now a paper on the bioarchive that's got, I think, 10, something like that, different 6th century samples of Yersinia pestis, of the plague bacterium. And so now you can follow its microevolution. You can down to the individual change in different outbreaks of the plague. So what's happening with the plague is really amazing. People are looking for the causes of the 2nd and 3rd century pandemics. For some reason, we don't have as much archaeological evidence, so there are a lot of 6th century mass graves. There just aren't as many from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And so we're going to get a couple of tries, and you don't always get it, right? I mean, you're more likely than not going to recover the genetic material of a pathogen 1,800 years ago. It's a small miracle when you do find it. And you're right, it helps that smallpox is a double-stranded DNA virus. It should technically preserve, but nobody's found smallpox that old yet. So the oldest archaeological smallpox is 17th century. So that's a problem. Measles, when you start to get into these RNA viruses, it's probably going to be harder, but the technology moves so fast, who knows? But yes, this is pretty revolutionary to be able to say these pathogens were there, and I think we're at the beginning of getting a much deeper understanding of the disease pools of the past.
So the disease ecologists are lining up here. I see Mercedes is ready to go.
The question by Derek, of course, we do know that population density and population numbers are absolutely critical dynamics, and we see it today with urbanization. We see differences within some of the mega cities between the transmission of viruses in the developing world in particular, in very, very dense